Alright, what up dudes? Today I brought you 5 clankers that I want to be added to Marvel Rivals. So I decided to build a team around Ultron so that they could team up together so I could really fill out the whole robot team. But due to Ultron's DPS nature, I did decide to make it a triple strategist comp with 1 DPS, 2 strategists, and 2 tanks. Now real quick before we get into the kits, do me a solid, head on down, hit that like and that sub button. We're really trying to get monetized by the end of the year, and I would love your help. And as always, if there's a character you want to see next time or a kit you think I could have done differently, let me know in the comments down below. Now without further ado, let's get into these filthy clankers. Now, while I'm sure this is no one's first pick for a robot tank, I would almost guarantee that that goes to Nimrod or a Sentinel. Though I guess technically they are haunted armor, but still. I personally love these dudes, and I would love to see them as a Vanguard. Now, they are technically on the Asgard map, but they're huge. Like, beyond enormous. So I'd hope they wouldn't be that big. Anyways, though, the Asgardian destroyers are basically enchanted suits of armor that are powered by spirits from Valhalla and Odin, partially, I believe. Now getting into his primary fire, we have Asgardian Blow. This is just a heavy punch combo that ends with a kick that knocks people back. For his secondary, we have Asgardian Defender. This is where the destroyer holds his hands up and blocks incoming damage by 80%. All damage blocked recharges his beam faster and fills a meter that improves his ability. Mythic Enchantment allows the Asgardian Destroyer to enter a state where his beam has unlimited resources and his sprint, which we'll get to in just a second, is constantly at top speed. Now the duration for this ability is entirely dependent on how much he has recently blocked with Asgardian Defender. For second real ability, it's time we go over Energy Overflow. This is a resource-based beam that he can fire out of his face that knocks enemies back and forces flyers to hit the ground before they can go back up again. For his final ability, we have Spirit Sprint. This is where the defender starts running. This will initially start out pretty slow. As he runs, he picks up more and more speed until he reaches top speed. During this, the defender can also leap into the air in a similar vein to Captain America. However, he wouldn't be able to jump quite as high. I see it much more as the thing's charge, but you can jump during it. So it's not quite a spring like Cap, but it's just a slight mobility addition. Now, at faster speeds, I would like to see him be able to jump longer, and while in the air, he has a special primary fire that allows him to wind up a punch, and once he hits the ground, he can drive an enemy into the dirt. Now, this essentially just knocks them down and stuns them for maybe half a second. Nothing terribly long. It's meant to be more of like a fly stopper ability, or honestly, I just thought it looked really cool. I couldn't get it out of my head, and I just loved the ability so much. So yeah, upon hitting someone after coming out of the air, you grind them into the dirt, and I imagine it would look awesome. Onto his passive, we have Unstoppable Destroyer. This allows the destroyer to never be able to be slowed and makes him completely immune to critical hits unless you shoot him in the opening of his face while he is firing his laser. Now the caveat to this passive is he takes significantly more critical hit damage. Now for his ultimate, we have Beam of the Allfather. This is where the destroyer charges up for a second and then fires out a beam. Now, differently from Energy Overflow, this one is much wider and it grabs onto enemies, pinning them, and wherever the beam ends, and at the end of the duration, or I assume there would be a canceling ability that would allow you to activate it, the beam explodes at the very end, dealing damage and displacing the enemies that you're able to pick up. Now, as for the style of this tank, I could very easily see him being a brawl tank and since I gave him so many push abilities, I love the idea of him being able to kind of set the pace even with other tanks. Using his beam to both push enemy tanks back, or alternatively, I could even see him using Energy Overflow to push enemy divers off of his backline. Because as we all know, if Black Panther misses one dash, then his entire kit is meaningless. So, one dash in, you fire your beam, it's able to keep the Black Panther off, and then you can kill him fairly easily. With the destroyer out of the way, let's get into the one that I am the most excited to showcase.
Maybe I am a monster. I don't think I'd know if I were one. And not what you are. And not what you intended. So there may be no way to make you trust me. But we need to go.
Now, in all honesty, I could see Vision being really any role, but I feel like Vanguard fits best because of his protective nature, especially in the films, and NetEase's undying belief that none of the Avengers are strategists. Not to mention his body is almost entirely made of vibranium, at least in the MCU. For his primary fire, we have Solar Spear. This is a short laser blast that fires out of his head and hits instantly. Obviously, this is a hit scan shot similar to Hela, but if you hold the button instead of just tapping it, immediately after the initial pulse, it will continue to fire out a steady beam. And this would work like an inverse version of Ultron's primary fire. Instead of a beam followed by a secondary shot that deals more damage, it is an initial burst of damage that can be followed up with a beam. That was the final nail in the coffin that really solidified that I was going to be going with that style for a primary fire. For one of his primary fires anyway. As for his second primary fire, I decided to give him Synthezoid Strike. This would be a melee combo that he can switch to in case someone's up in his face. An additional part of Synthezoid Strike allows him to gain a secondary effect onto his punches depending on which passive is active. Now, getting into his secondary fire, we have Mental Wall. This is where you can select an area to produce a yellow shield that your allies can walk through and shoot through, but enemies can do neither. Additionally, your Searing Spear gains a damage buff when fired through the shield. Now, for my personal favorite part of his kit, we have Density Manipulation. This is an ability that allows Vision to swap between his two passives, which are Light as Air, which turns Vision into a flying tank permanently with increased movement, and his melee attacks gain a lock-on effect similar to Iron Fist. Now, I would like to note these are not percent-based melees like Iron Fist, but they would have the same lock-on. However, Density Manipulation can also swap him over into his secondary passive, Immovable Object, where Vision cannot fly, becomes unstoppable, which is the effect that the thing has that stops him from being able to be moved forcefully by any means or be immune to certain CC effects. And for his bonus effect on his Synthezoid Strike, the first hit of his melee attack applies the Earthbound effect, stopping movement abilities and grounding flyers. Now, we'll get into a bit more of how I think that this would play in just a moment, but I want to talk about the inspiration behind Vision for just a second. Now, Vision is very philosophical, at least in the MCU, and I thought that is a perfect segue to work his kit into the ancient Chinese paradox of the spear and the shield. If you're unfamiliar, essentially there's a merchant who claims to sell a spear that can pierce any shield, and a shield that can block any spear. Now, this in and of itself is a paradox, which I feel like works perfectly for Ultron and Vision. With Ultron being made to be something beautiful and turning out to be the most dangerous thing ever invented, and with Vision made to be something to destroy humanity and becoming something that wants to preserve life. These two things are paradoxes of each other, as neither two can succeed in the same universe. And on top of that, with Vision being very philosophical in the MCU, as I'm not too terribly familiar with his comic iteration, I thought it would just be a perfect point to not only point out this really cool paradox, to give Vision's kit a little bit more inspiration, rather than I saw him kick ass in the comics a couple times. But with that explanation out of the way, his next ability is Telepathic Gauge. It's where Vision fires out a psychic tether from the Mind Stone buried in the center of his head that allows Vision to view enemies' ult charge so long as he's within range for the tether. So he has to stay close to them, but while in that time, if he hits tab, he can see the enemy's ult charge, or there can be a little graphic on screen. Now, obviously, if the enemy has any movement abilities, they can snap this tether fairly easily. Now, I won't lie, I did go back and forth on whether or not to make the thing in the center of his forehead the Mind Stone or the Solar Gem that he has in the comics. I decided to go with the Mind Stone simply because I will be doing Thanos again. Technically, if you saw my first ever Marvel Rivals video, you know I already did Thanos, but I will be remaking his kit, and I have a special idea involved for the Infinity Stones. I wanted to go ahead and throw the Mind Stone here with Vision. Alternatively, I did think it could be really cool if he had the Mind Stone in his forehead and then his Solar Gem embedded in his chest. Now, I don't know much about the comic Vision, I won't lie, so I don't really know what that thing in his chest is or how important it is. But if you know, please tell me. Onto his next ability, we have Astral Dash. This is where Vision goes completely spectral. allowing him to fly faster and go through any walls and phase through any projectiles. Now, he cannot attack while using this ability, and it is not resource based. Once the activation ends, it goes on a cooldown and you cannot use it again. I really wanted to make it resource based so that you could tap it to like phase through Magneto's dunk, but I feel like just being able to tap it and have a bunch of projectiles flow through you would just be really busted, so I feel like the best way to make it would be cooldown focused. Now for his ultimate ability, we have Love Persevering. This is where Vision utilizes the Mind Stone to guard the allies and an aura around him, granting himself and all of them immunity to secondary effects of all abilities. It's essentially making them immune to the following, but not limited to: Vibranium Marks, Mind Control from Emma Frost's ultimate, Sparks from Phoenix, the Thing's Earthbound, being slowed by enemies, or the reduced healing effect of Blade, or any other secondary effects I forget to mention here. Additionally, while in this area, there is a slight amount of bonus health that is given to allies while in the area for the entire duration. Something similar to how Captain America gives some bonus health if you stay around him and his ult, which if you don't know, he does, and you should stay around him. Now I see this Vision playing as a bit of an anchor tank and a bit of a poke tank. Obviously he has some brawl capabilities with a movable object and being able to fly in and then drop down on them, becoming invincible, or not invincible, but unstoppable. However, I feel like he's strongest with his poke style, using his mental wall to both block damage, but I also feel like you wouldn't want to use it like a Doctor Strange shield, because while it's up, you're doing extra damage, so you'd kind of want to take some off angles with it, while maybe Doctor Strange goes down the middle and really takes a lot of the aggro. Overall, I don't feel like this style of Vision would be a very hard tank to play, but I do love the idea of having a tank, but I do just love the idea of having a tank that can swap between flying or being grounded. That's why I love the idea for War Machine so much. All right, with Vision completed, allow me to introduce our esteemed guest for the evening, the original Clanker. So please, everyone, let's put our hands together for the one, the only.
Roger, roger.
Thank you so much for coming, B1 Battle Droid. It is an honor to have you. Now, if you don't know this guy, Christ, that made me realize how old those movies are. Anyways, these guys are the best soldiers Star Wars has ever created, at least in my opinion. But not wasting any time, getting into his primary fire, we have the E5 blaster rifle. This is a laser rifle that fires out a projectile that deals critical damage if it is deflected back into him. Meaning, if you're standing in front of a Captain America, shoot his shield, and it bounces off hitting you again, you take double the damage that you would have dealt to anyone else. Just like they do whenever a Jedi deflects their pulses back at them. Onto a secondary, we have Repeater Rifle. This just simply switches your laser rifle into full auto, allowing you to fire significantly faster. For his first real ability, we have Rocket Pack. This is a jetpack that allows him to fly. Not like the Trash Panda support character that just dashes forward, you actually become a flying character for a moment. For his final ability, now for his second and final ability, we have Grenadier Attachment. This is where the battle droid cooks a grenade in his hand that explodes after a few seconds, and I would have this deal some pretty significant AoE damage due to the potential delay. Now this does also deal damage to the B1 series battle droid. I feel like it'd be really funny to watch them explode if you cook the grenade for too long in your hand, or if you stand on top of your own grenade after throwing it. Onto his passive, we have Optical Programming. This is a passive that allows the battle droid to have their primary fire lock onto any enemy as long as they are above a certain height. This is just his primary and secondary fire technically. Now I just want to point out that that does not apply to his ultimate, ATST Inbound. For the B1 series battle clanker, deploys an ATST or Chicken Walker that walks around firing massive plasma blasts until the timer runs out and it falls over, exploding on whoever is within the area. I see this as a bit more of a mobile version of Hela's ultimate. However, it's a lot lower to the ground. So Hela would have more of an aerial view, whereas the B1 series battle clanker is more mobile. While it is very slow, he's able to turn a corner or two in order to get a better shot off on someone. Overall, I feel like the style that this character would play in is fairly basic. It would be a lot more like Punisher, maybe a midline attacker looking for off angles and using his grenades realistically just to hurl at tanks or into big clusters of enemy teams. Now originally I did plan to do 2 duelists and toss a Dalek into this category too. But we've had enough duelists recently, and calling Ultron a strategist is kind of like calling Soldier 76 a support. But with that finished, let's get into our first strategist.
You just had to let the dog out. Do you understand the futility of your bleeding heart, of fighting the future?
You're a monster.
I was born this way.
Now, Bastion here is a combination between Nimrod and Master Mold. Both of these characters are essentially the final bosses to stand against mutant kind, and there's a lot more to his whole mutant-hating regime and his story in general, but for this kit, all you really need to know is his affinity for using a techno-organic virus that can transmute organic matter into techno-mechanical material that he has complete and total control over, since that is where I took the basis of his abilities from. Onto his abilities, let's start off with his primary fire, Disintegration Beam. Now this beam strictly damages enemies, however Bastion gains constant lifesteal from the attack. Additionally, any damage dealt by this primary fire also heals anyone under your ability called Aid. This simply allows you to select 3 allies to gain healing over time, and whenever you deal damage, that healing over time doubles. Now backtracking here for a secondary fire, we have Infect. This is where Bastion uses some of his reserve to infect an enemy, causing them to deal reduced damage, and all damage dealt to them heals Bastion and anyone else who has the Aid effect on them. Now before we get into his other abilities, I want to go over that reserve that I mentioned. His passive, Techno-Organic Virus. Bastion has a reserve of this virus that he can unleash on its enemies and allies for a constant effect. Once this resource is depleted, he has to recall it in order to regain his passive. Obviously, under certain circumstances, he would regain it naturally. For example, if he puts Infect on an enemy and they die, then that would immediately flood back to him. Or it could even leech onto the next enemy closest by. I think that could also be pretty cool. But back to his second ability, we have Arise. When an ally or an enemy falls in battle, you can use up your passive resource to cause them to get back up. Allies will control their character while they respawn, but enemies act as bots on your team until they're destroyed. You can only ever have one character active at a time. Now, I do feel like realistically there would be a timer on this. Most likely whenever the character that you're reanimating respawns, the bot immediately clocks out. For his third ability, we have Protect. This is where Bastion utilizes this virus and grants him or an ally a bubble that blocks all incoming damage for his health pool. The health pool is entirely dependent on how much of this virus you give up, and once your virus is depleted in this way, it will gradually tick back up to how much you used. Now for his ultimate, my personal favorite part, we have Mechanical Necromancy. This is where Bastion emits a constant aura where all allies are constantly under the effect of his Aid and Protect. Additionally, while in this area, anyone that dies is instantly brought back with 100 overshields, or 350 for tanks, and enemies turn into bots that attack their allies for the duration, wanting to stay close to Bastion. These remain active even after their respawn period, meaning that essentially you can have your team and the enemy team fighting the enemy team for the duration of your ultimate, if you time it perfectly. During this time, you can use your Infect ability to basically tell the bots to focus someone. And I will say that these bots are similar to what you would see in Practice versus AI. So strategist characters would not just attack enemies, they would primarily focus on healing Bastion if he got lower health. I could see Bastion as a powerful support, but also as a very resource management heavy support. Maybe not in the same way that Mantis is, but I could definitely see Bastion adding a lot of uniqueness to the support role, especially for someone who is so mutant hating. I think it would be really fun to hear some of his interactions with like Magneto or Logan, even Ultron really. I think it could be really fun to just hear those interactions. And as for how he would actually play, I can see him being a bit more of a mid-range support, wanting to stay behind the tanks in just the perfect range to hit his disintegration beam, while keeping his Aid effect on the tanks, and then if you have a diver, them, or your fellow support. And I could definitely see you using Infect as a means to deter flankers or divers, and even if your strategist character does get dove and they do die, you can always use your Arise to simply get them back up. I think Bastion could work in this way, and it would be really fun for the support category to have a character like this. Overall, I think that he could work in this way, and he would add some much needed fun to the support category. All right, now onto our final kit of the video. I decided to do something a little different than really any of my other videos.
I hoped you would. I wanted to show you. I don't have anyone else. I think a lot about meteors, the purity of them. Boom, the end, start again.
I feel like there's a lot that could have been done better about Ultron as a strategist. So I decided to remake his kit with a little more inspiration from the MCU and comics, rather than just giving him a laser and one of those Amazon delivery drones. For his primary fire, we have photon phalanges. Sorry, I just love that word. Which is a 5-part ranged laser attack where he shoots one beam with each of his fingers, the first 4 in quick succession, and then the 5th one is where he fires all 5 beams at once. So he wouldn't deal too much damage with the first 5, but they would be quicker to make up for that. Now, it's important to note that this attack only damages enemies. However, his secondary fire, a cephalo beam, I think I said that right, is where Ultron continuously fires a piercing beam of healing out of his palm. I would like for this to be the other hand. So one hand is shooting lasers, and the other hand can shoot a beam of healing. That's important because the primary and secondary fires can be fired simultaneously, but they share the same ammo reserve. Similar to how Iron Man works or how Jeff's primary fire used to work, where you can fire your lasers and it take a % off, or you can fire the beam and it'll just drain it quickly. Now for his first ability, we have Nano Enhancement. This is where Ultron activates an enhancement program in his body that gives him 100 extra overshields, a movement speed increase, and turns his primary and secondary fires into healing and damage abilities. So this is a form he would pop in a similar way to when Luna claps her hands. Whenever you lose a strategist and you need a little bit more healing, or if you're being really pressured and you need some more health, you can activate Nano Enhancement to become essentially superior than you were before and fire out your photon phalanges and a cephalo beam simultaneously, allowing you to heal a lot more or damage a lot more, depending on whichever one you need. Now his second ability is literally just based off of a scene that I loved from Age of Ultron. It's called Magnetos. Now there's a scene in Age of Ultron where Ultron grabs a piece of the stonework with some sort of mechanical telekinesis and hurls it at Iron Man. And I really like that idea, so I would like for Ultron to be able to pull up a section of the wall or the floor, whatever's closest, and hurl it at an enemy in order to stun them and knock them down. Now his third ability is probably the most complex and, in my opinion, controversial one that I think could work but would need a lot of specific tuning. This ability is called Substitute Drones, or as I will be referring to it, Sub-Ultron Drones. Unlike Ultron 1.0, which is the one that we have in Marvel Rivals, this Ultron's drones can be damaged and destroyed. However, for Ultron 2.0, this one can place his drones on the ground or on an ally. Now these drones are just smaller, less detailed versions of Ultron. They attack passively, similar to how a Namor turret would, and they emit a constant AoE healing like how the current Ultron's delivery drone works. However, during this time, he can only ever have 2 drones placed on an ally or on the ground at any time. Now, the bigger, more worrying part of this, in my opinion, is his passive, No Strings on Me, which allows Ultron to swap his consciousness with one of the sub-Ultron drones he puts on his allies or the ground. Meaning, if at any point Ultron dies, he can immediately be reborn as one of those drones. Now, these drones are not the exact same thing as Ultron. They only have his primary and secondary fires. Other than that, they have absolutely no abilities except for his passive String on Me. And during this time, it would have the AoE healing effect that the main Ultron body does not have. After Ultron's main body respawns, either hit the button to swap back to the main body, or it will automatically swap you back if the main body is within range. Whew, okay, that was a lot, but I really like the idea of Ultron being able to take over drone bodies that he sets up. I think it makes a lot more sense, especially for Ultron's character, which can essentially be summed up with the William Afton quote of, "I always come back." Since in the comics, you never really get rid of Ultron. He's always lurking around the corner just waiting to pop back up. And I actually believe he's still waiting just to pop back up in the MCU. But that's for a future film video, not for this Marvel Rivals one. For his final ability, we have his ultimate, Binary Blessings. Now upon hitting Q, Ultron calls in 5 drones to fly around him, similar to how his ultimate works now. However, in that initial call, there is a pulse that he radiates, and any ally in the area also gains their own sub-Ultron drone. The 5 drones that fly around Ultron act as his current ultimate does in a way. They follow him, they hang behind him, and anytime he uses his primary or secondary fire, they do as well, essentially making it so that every single shot he has is quintupled. Now during this time, if Ultron dies, he immediately takes over the form of his closest drone. So he would swap around between the 5 drones around him, and each of those 5 would count as the main body, capable of using his other abilities, but the ones that allies hold onto would still be sub-Ultron drones, incapable of using any of his fancy abilities. And that's Ultron 2.0. Overall, I like the kit a bit more as a strategist, as far as being a strategist, but I do also love the one Rivals made. And I do want to really quickly clear up, I am not trying to say that I made a better kit than Marvel Rivals or anything of that sort. Personally, I like the one that Marvel Rivals made, but as far as being a support character goes, I don't feel like Ultron's healing really stacks up to the point where he really fits into that many team composition. He works good in triple strategist comps, but anyone works good in a triple strategist comp. But that's just my opinion. If there are any characters already in Rivals that you guys would like to see remade in a future video, please let me know in the comments down below. I already have a plan to remake Black Panther to try to make him into a character that doesn't have to go from drastically bad or good, but I'll save that one for a future video. For now, let's get into the team-ups. Now for this team-ups, I really wanted to try and branch out. There's a couple characters that I couldn't necessarily think of any specific team-ups for. Obviously the B1 Battle Droid and the Bastion were 2 that I really just couldn't nail down anything in particular for. But for the ones that I did come up with, we have Asgard's Guardians, where the Destroyer anchors and Thor gains a secondary fire while in his Rune Awakened form that allows him to shoot a beam of lightning that builds up a slow on enemies, deals damage, and will ground flyers, and will keep flyers on the ground as long as the lightning beam is on them. Then for Vision, I came up with Loving Chaos, where Vision and Wanda have a mutual team-up, where Vision gains access to an ability to make his primary fire lock on similar to Wanda's primary fire. And Wanda gains a personal small shield that she can summon on the ground that acts just like Vision's by boosting her damage with less health. So whereas Vision's would have probably close to 500-ish health, Wanda's here would have like 150, 200. The next one I came up with was Unlimited Energy, where Ultron 2.0 or 1.0 and Storm team up, where Storm anchors and Ultron gains an activatable ability to grant him unlimited ammo while in her aura. As far as which Ultron this is technically made for, I would definitely say mine. The Marvel Rivals Ultron's ammo is never usually a problem. I rarely remember when I reload, in complete honesty. But my Ultron that I made, Ultron 2.0, but for Ultron 2.0, the one I made, his ammo reserve is something he'd have to constantly keep an eye on, especially if you're firing both your primary and secondary fire simultaneously. Now for the whole Clankers team up, we have Silicon Savior, where Ultron 1.0 teams up with all the other Clankers, gain an activatable ability to summon one of Ultron's healing bots, these are the ones currently in Marvel Rivals, the Amazon delivery drones, that will stay on them for the entire duration. I would say it would probably be about maybe 6 to 8 seconds. Alright y'all, those are 5 robots that I made for Marvel Rivals. Now, similar to how I did Ultron, I plan to redesign some other characters that are already in Marvel Rivals, so once again, if there's a character you can think of that you'd like to see redone into a different role or just a better kit for their current role, leave a suggestion down below, I'd love to read them. But that's going to be it for me, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye!